despised by the Austro-Hungarian court, called the clumsy camel, publicly blamed by her own mother-in-law, Empress Sisi, for driving her son to suicide, remembered by history as the cold, boring wife who was the footnote to her husband's tragedy. But she was the real victim, the wife he betrayed, infected with a venereal disease that left her sterile and publicly humiliated by choosing to die with a 17-year-old girl. Her name was Crown Princess Stéphanie of Belgium. How did the blame for his sins end up staining her name? And how was a victim forced to live as the villain for the next 56 years of her life? That tragedy was inevitable. Stéphanie was crushed between two worlds that could never be reconciled, the world she was born into and the world she was forced to join. Imagine Europe in the late 19th century. On the surface, it was La Belle Époque, the beautiful era, a world of industrial progress, art, grand boulevards in Paris, and glittering ballrooms in Vienna. But beneath that gilded veneer, the continent was a pressure cooker of tension. Old empires were grappling with rising nationalism, and the royal families of Europe were essentially one giant dysfunctional family club. Most monarchs were cousins of Queen Victoria, and Stéphanie's family, the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, was one of the most successful players in this royal game. The first world is Belgium, Stéphanie's home. You have to understand Belgium was a startup nation at the time. It had only gained its independence in 1830. Stéphanie's grandfather, Leopold I, was a clever German prince who was invited to be king. He was nicknamed the Uncle of Europe, a master matchmaker who skillfully married his relatives into royal families across the continent, including Britain. Stéphanie's father, Leopold II, was a man who inherited that ambition but lacked his father's charm. In Belgium, he was praised as the Builder King, who turned Brussels into a magnificent city. But history knows him for a much darker, bloodier legacy, his brutal rule over the Congo Free State. Leopold II was a cold, calculating man who viewed his family, especially his daughters, as nothing more than tools to consolidate his power and wealth. He saw Belgium as a corporation, and he was the CEO. Stéphanie's mother, Marie Henriette of Austria, was a Habsburg princess herself, but her marriage to Leopold II was an absolute disaster. They utterly despised each other. Leopold was openly unfaithful, while Marie Henriette retreated into her love of horses. This was the world Stéphanie grew up in, a new money royal family, immensely wealthy but emotionally frigid, a place where affection was a luxury, and duty and political value were everything. And then we have the second world, the one Stéphanie was about to be thrown into, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, ruled by the House of Habsburg-Lorraine. If the Coburgs of Belgium were new money, the Habsburgs were old money, to the point of being fossilized. This was the oldest, proudest, and perhaps most rigid dynasty in Europe. They had ruled vast swathes of Europe for 1,000 years. The Hofburg Palace in Vienna wasn't just a home, it was a machine operated by something called Spanish court etiquette, a terrifyingly complex set of rules that dictated everything from how you ate, how you dressed, to how you bowed. It was designed to make the monarch a living god and everyone else a servant. And at the head of this machine was Emperor Franz Joseph I, Stéphanie's future father-in-law. Franz Joseph wasn't really a man. He was the embodiment of duty. He was a tireless worker who woke up at 3:30 a.m. every day, who treated ruling as a dull bureaucratic job. He'd been on the throne since 1848, and he hated change. He was the past. Beside him, or more accurately, frequently far away from him, was Empress Elizabeth, or Sisi. If you've seen the movies, you might think of Sisi as a romantic. The reality was far more complex. She was a legendary beauty, yes, but also a deeply insecure and selfish woman. She was obsessed with preserving her beauty and figure, spending hours a day brushing her ankle-length hair and following extreme diets. She loathed the rigidity of the Vienna court so much that she spent most of her time traveling, fleeing her duties as empress and even her own children. She lived in her own fantasy world, a fairy queen who didn't belong in the real one. So we have two families in complete contrast. On one side, the Coburgs, a new dynasty, ambitious, commercially wealthy, but also cold and ruthless. On the other side, the Habsburgs, an ancient, proud dynasty, rigid to the point of being fossilized, ruled by a man who was the embodiment of the past and a woman who had fled the present. And these two broken, dysfunctional families decided that the best solution for their future was to force their children to marry each other. Stephanie, a product of Coburg coldness, was about to be thrown into the furnace of Habsburg rigidity. What could possibly go wrong? Before Stephanie became a pawn in a political game, she was a child. And her childhood, though spent in palaces, was far from a fairy tale. As we said, her father, Leopold II, was a terrifying and distant man. Her mother, Marie Henriette, was perpetually unhappy and found joy only in her horses. Family affection was something Stephanie and her sisters, Louise, her older sister, and Clementine, her younger, read about in books, not something they experienced. And then when Stephanie was just 5 years old, tragedy struck the family. Her only brother, Prince Leopold, Duke of Brabant, the heir to the Belgian throne, died of pneumonia after falling into a pond. The boy's death completely destroyed what little was left of her parents' marriage. Leopold II ruthlessly blamed his wife. More importantly for Belgium, there was now no direct male heir. Belgian law, the Salic law, forbade women from inheriting the throne. What did this mean for Stephanie? It meant that her value, which was already tied to a good marriage, now skyrocketed. She and her sisters couldn't rule, so they had to marry men who could, or at least solidify, Belgium's position. The pressure on this 5-year-old girl was unimaginable. She was no longer a child. She was a strategic asset. Her education was severe. She learned languages, history, music, and the art of the perfect curtsy. She was intelligent and eager to learn, but she was also profoundly naive about the world. She was raised in a controlled bubble, shielded from the harsh realities of life. She was groomed to be a perfect storybook princess with no idea that the real world was full of dragons, and not all princes were charming. Meanwhile, in Vienna, the biggest prize in Europe was causing nothing but trouble: Crown Prince Rudolf, the sole heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Rudolf was a mess of contradictions. He was incredibly intelligent, perhaps a genius. Unlike his conservative father, Rudolf was a liberal, a progressive. He believed in science. He secretly wrote anti-clerical articles and criticized his father's policies. He saw his multi-ethnic empire collapsing under the weight of nationalism, and he wanted to reform it. He was the future. But he was also a mentally tortured man. He had the Habsburg melancholy, a genetic disposition for depression. He was impulsive, moody, and, like his mother Sisi, he felt trapped by the court. To cope, he threw himself into alcohol, drugs, and, most of all, women. By age 21, Rudolf was a notorious womanizer who already had a long list of affairs and sexually transmitted diseases. He was torn between his progressive brain and his self-destructive impulses. Emperor Franz Joseph, in desperation, believed only one thing could stabilize his erratic son: a marriage. And so the hunt began. They needed a princess. She had to be Catholic. She had to be from a good royal family. She had to be strong enough to tame Rudolf and, most importantly, produce a male heir. At first, Leopold II had his sights set on Spain, But then the golden opportunity presented itself. The Austrian court began making inquiries about Belgium. For Leopold II, this was the jackpot. Marrying his daughter to the heir of the ancient Habsburg dynasty would be his crowning achievement. It would legitimize his startup dynasty forever. Stéphanie, now 15, was suddenly the centerpiece of high-stakes diplomatic negotiations. Their first meeting took place in Brussels in March 1880. It was a carefully orchestrated court ball. Stéphanie, just 15, was completely starstruck. Rudolph, 21, walked in. He was the heir to an empire, and to a sheltered young girl, he seemed to be everything she was taught to admire. She fell for him immediately. Her diaries are full of naive gushing about how handsome and intelligent he was. Rudolph's reaction was less enthusiastic. In a letter to his tutor, Rudolph was brutally frank. He admitted Stéphanie was pretty, but added she was a bit awkward, and clearly a naive child. He wasn't in love, he wasn't attracted, but he saw one important thing in her. She is a good, dutiful girl. In other words, she seemed manageable. She would do her duty, produce an heir, and stay out of his private life. For Rudolph, it was a transaction. For Stéphanie, it was a dream. For their fathers, it was a political victory. Just days later, at the Palace of Laeken, Rudolph proposed. Stéphanie, in her youthful ecstasy, accepted. The engagement was announced. All of Europe celebrated. The press hailed it as a love match, a perfect union of youth and the future. Leopold II had gotten his wish. But there was one problem. Stéphanie wasn't ready. She was only turning 16 in May 1880, and by Habsburg standards she was still too young. They had to wait. The marriage was postponed for nearly a year. A long, agonizing year in which Stéphanie was sent to Vienna to be finished, essentially to be molded into the Habsburg template. And then the big day arrived, May 10th, 1881. It was a breathtaking spectacle. Vienna was at its most glorious. Thousands of citizens lined the streets. St. Augustine's church was packed with royalty and nobility from all over Europe. Stéphanie, just shy of her 17th birthday, looked like a true fairy tale princess. She wore a magnificent gown of silver silk, embroidered with the golden eagles of the Habsburgs, and a stunning diamond tiara. As she walked down the aisle, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. She was marrying Crown Prince Rudolph. She was going to be the future empress of a mighty empire. All the pressure, all the lessons, all the sacrifices of her childhood seemed worth it. Her dream had come true. But then the palace doors closed. The crowds disappeared. And that night in the royal bedchamber, the fairy tale shattered into a million pieces. This is one of the hidden parts of the story, one that Stéphanie later described in her memoirs with unconcealed horror. Stéphanie, at nearly 17, was completely ignorant of the physical realities of marriage. Her mother, in an incredible failure of motherhood, had not told her a single thing. She entered her bedroom that night, naive as a child, expecting some gentle romance. What she got was a husband, Rudolph, who was not only impatient and experienced only with easy women, but who may also have been drunk. For him, this was a duty to be performed. For her, it was a terrifying, confusing, and painful ordeal. She described it not as a loving union, but as a brutal assault. It was not the beginning of a partnership. It was a traumatic initiation, one that set a dynamic of fear, duty, and resentment that would haunt their marriage until its tragic, final day. In just a few hours, Stéphanie had learned the cold, hard truth. She may have married a prince, but she was most certainly not living in a fairy tale. Welcome back. When we left Stéphanie, she was 17 years old. The grandest wedding of the decade had just ended, the crowds had gone home, and the reality of her new life had hit her with a traumatic force. The fairy tale was over. The door to the gilded cage of the Habsburg court had slammed shut, and she was trapped inside with a man she suddenly realized she didn't know at all. A man who saw her not as a partner, but as a duty. What does life look like the morning after your dream becomes a nightmare? For Stéphanie, it meant putting on the mask of the crown princess and beginning the fight for survival. Life in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna was unlike anything Stéphanie had ever experienced. Her father's court in Brussels was cold and corporate, yes, but it was also modern. The Hofburg, by contrast, was a living museum, a fortress of tradition. Think about this. The palace complex was so ancient and sprawling that the Kaisergruft, the imperial crypt where generations of Habsburgs were buried, was literally right there. You were in essence living with the dead, and the living weren't much warmer. The entire court was governed by the suffocating Spanish court etiquette. This was a rigid, centuries-old set of rules that dictated every second of your day. It prescribed how many bows you gave, who could speak to you, who you could speak to, what you wore, when you ate, and even how you held your hands. There was no room for spontaneity, no room for genuine emotion. It was a machine designed to elevate the emperor and empress to godlike status. And Stéphanie was now just a cog in that machine. She was completely, utterly alone. She was a foreigner, a Coburg, and the Austrian aristocracy, one of the most snobbish in the world, looked down on her. They found her new money Belgian background to be unsophisticated. She was a 17-year-old girl, far from home, with no friends, no allies, and a husband who was, at best, indifferent. She tried desperately to find allies within the family. She looked first to her father-in-law, the man who was the heart of the empire, Emperor Franz Joseph. Franz Joseph was, as we discussed, a machine of duty. He wasn't a cruel man, but he was emotionally vacant. He saw Stéphanie as a new soldier in his army. Her job was to be the crown princess, to perform her duties, and above all, to produce a male heir. Stéphanie was intelligent and dutiful by nature, so she tried to win his approval. She was punctual. She was respectful. She attended every mind-numbing official ceremony without complaint, and Franz Joseph approved in his own cold way. He saw that she was reliable, which was the highest compliment he could pay anyone, but there was no warmth, no fatherly affection. He didn't ask her how she felt. He didn't offer her comfort. He simply expected her to do her job. When she failed in his eyes, he would be ruthless. But for now, she was a satisfactory employee. So, if the father was a block of ice, what about the mother? What about the one woman in the court who should have understood what it felt like to be a young bride trapped in this system? What about Empress Sisi? This, for Stéphanie, became the most painful relationship of all. Sisi's cruelty wasn't overt, like a theatrical villain. It was the far more painful cruelty of disdain, of absence, of snobbery. Stéphanie, having grown up with a cold mother, was starved for maternal affection. She arrived in Vienna desperately hoping that this legendary, beautiful empress would be the mother she never had. She admired Sisi. She wanted Sisi's approval more than anything, and Sisi despised her. To Sisi, who was neurotically obsessed with her own thinness and ethereal beauty, Stéphanie was a clumsy, unsophisticated lump. Sisi was a creature of myth and air. Stéphanie was a healthy, grounded 17-year-old girl from Belgium. Sisi would make cutting, backhanded remarks. She criticized Stéphanie's clothes. She mocked her German accent. Behind her back, she gave her cruel nicknames like the little Belgian lump, or most famously, that clumsy camel. Imagine that. You are a teenager in a foreign land. Your husband ignores you. And the one woman you look up to, your mother-in-law, the most famous woman in the world, thinks you are a joke. She makes no effort to guide Stephanie, to protect her, or to include her. Instead, most of the time, Sisi wasn't even there. She used any excuse to flee Vienna, to go on her endless travels to Greece, to England, to Hungary, anywhere but the court she hated. And she left Stephanie to fend for herself completely undefended. So what about her husband? What about Rudolf? To be fair, in the very beginning, they tried. Rudolf was an intelligent man, and Stephanie was a smart and curious woman. For a brief, flickering moment, there was a spark of intellectual connection. Rudolf was a progressive, a liberal, and he found in Stephanie an eager student. He would talk to her about his political ideas, his frustrations with his father's old-fashioned empire. They traveled together on official duties to Prague and to the Middle East. Stephanie was fascinated. This was the man she thought she had married. She tried to engage with his world, to be the intellectual partner he claimed he wanted. But there was a problem. Stephanie was, at her core, a product of her upbringing. She was conventional, conservative, and deeply religious. Rudolph's ideas weren't just liberal, they were radical. He was anti-clerical, perhaps even an atheist. He secretly wrote anonymous newspaper articles attacking his own father's government. Stephanie was horrified. She believed in the monarchy. She believed in the church. She couldn't be the radical partner he craved. And Rudolph, in turn, found her conventional mind to be boring. The intellectual spark fizzled out, and he began to look elsewhere, not just for physical pleasure, but for intellectual companionship. Their marriage, which had started with a trauma, now settled into a cold, polite distance. They were two strangers living in the same palace, but there was one duty that bound them, one job that Stephanie had to perform. The entire empire was waiting. The press, the court, the emperor, everyone was watching her, waiting for one thing: a male heir. The pressure was immense. Every month that passed was seen as a public failure. Stephanie knew that her entire value as crown princess, her only security in this hostile court, depended on her ability to get pregnant. And then, finally, it happened. In 1883, the court announced that the crown princess was with child. The empire celebrated. This was it. This would fix everything. A child would surely bring Rudolph and Stephanie together, and a boy would secure the dynasty. On September 2nd, 1883, Stephanie gave birth, but it wasn't a boy. It was a girl. A healthy, beautiful baby girl named Archduchess Elizabeth Marie, who would be known to the family as Erzy. For Stephanie, this was a moment of pure, transcendent joy. In that cold, loveless palace, she finally had someone to love. Erzy became her entire world, her anchor, her only source of genuine happiness. She poured every ounce of affection she had into her daughter. But for the court, the reaction was polite disappointment. A girl was nice, but where was the herb prince, the crown prince? Emperor Franz Joseph was not satisfied. The job was not done. The pressure on Stephanie didn't stop, it doubled. Try again, was the unspoken command, and do it right this time. This right here is where the story turns from an unhappy marriage into an irreversible tragedy. This is the part of the story that was hidden for decades. A secret so devastating it explains everything that came after. Rudolph was spiraling. He was politically castrated by his father, who ignored all his ideas for reform. He felt like a failure as an heir. His marriage was a sham. He was bored and depressed. So he leaned into his only escape, his self-destruction. He wasn't just having casual affairs anymore. He was living a complete double life. At night, he would shed his royal uniform, and with his favorite cab driver, a man named Bratfish, he would descend into the antisocial districts of Vienna. He spent his nights with actresses, dancers, and prostitutes. He was drinking heavily and was now, according to many historians, addicted to morphine, which he used to treat his nerves and, very likely, the symptoms of the STDs he was constantly contracting. Stephanie knew he was unfaithful. It was a public humiliation. He would openly flirt with actresses at the opera, while his wife sat beside him. It was agonizing, but for a 19th century royal, it was almost to be expected. But then, sometime around 1886, something far worse happened. Stephanie became gravely, mysteriously ill. She was suffering from agonizing abdominal pain, a raging fever. She was diagnosed with peritonitis, a life-threatening infection of the pelvic organs. The court doctors were baffled, or at least they pretended to be, but the cause was no mystery. Rudolf, in his depraved nightly excursions, had contracted a severe venereal disease, almost certainly gonorrhea, and he had passed it to his wife. Let's be crystal clear about what this meant. This wasn't just infidelity. This was a physical violation that had catastrophic, permanent consequences. First, the physical. The infection was so severe that it ravaged her reproductive organs. When the fever finally broke and she recovered, the doctors had to deliver the final devastating news. The infection had caused so much internal scarring that her fallopian tubes were blocked. She was now permanently, irreversibly sterile. She could never have another child. Second, the political. Think about what this meant in her world. Her one job, her single defining purpose as crown princess, was to produce a male heir. And now, thanks to her husband's debauchery, she had failed. He had, in effect, destroyed her entire reason for existing in the Habsburg court. She could never be the mother of a future emperor. She was now, in the eyes of the court and the emperor, useless. And third, the emotional. This was the final unforgivable betrayal. It went beyond the humiliation of affairs. He had physically mutilated her. He had taken away her health, her future, and her one purpose. Any last ember of affection, any lingering hope for reconciliation, was extinguished forever. She was, in her own words, filled with moral and physical disgust. The marriage was over. It wasn't just unhappy, it was a tomb. They became two ghosts haunting the palace. They slept in separate wings. They could barely stand to be in the same room. They appeared together only for the most formal, unavoidable state functions, forcing brittle smiles for the public while seething with mutual hatred. Stephanie's life contracted, focusing entirely on her one precious thing, her daughter, Ersi. She clung to her as her only reason for living. Rudolf, meanwhile, plunged into his final dark spiral. Perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of despair, his addictions worsened. His health, ravaged by syphilis, gonorrhea, alcohol, and morphine, was collapsing. He was racked with headaches, joint pain, and paranoia, and he became obsessed with death. His political dreams were dead. His marriage was dead. He felt he was dead too. He began to talk openly, morbidly, about suicide. He saw it as the only logical, romantic escape from a life he could no longer bear. He was desperate, and he decided he didn't want to go alone. In a now infamous incident, he approached his longtime favorite mistress, a high-class courtesan named Mizzi Kaspar. He brought a skull and a revolver, and he asked her to die with him in a suicide pact. Mizzi, a pragmatic and sensible woman, not only refused but was so terrified that she went to the Vienna police. She reported that the crown prince was suicidal and a danger to himself. The police did nothing. How could they? Arrest the heir to the empire? They quietly reported it to their superiors, and the warning was buried. Rudolf's offer had been rejected. He was still looking for a partner in death. And that is when a 17-year-old starstruck, deeply romantic, and dangerously naive schoolgirl, Baroness Mary Vetsera, who had a fanatic celebrity-style crush on the tragic crown prince, began writing him obsessive, adoring letters. She let it be known to his inner circle that she would do anything for him, that she understood his tragic soul, that she would, if he asked, be willing to die with him. The final fatal pieces of the puzzle were falling into place at this darkest point of a marriage that had become a waking nightmare. Crown Princess Stephanie, now 22 years old, was living as a stranger in her own home, permanently scarred and left sterile by her husband, Crown Prince Rudolph. He, in turn, had fallen into a deep spiral of addiction, disease, and depression. Having failed to convince one mistress to die with him, he had just found a new, tragically eager volunteer, the 17-year-old starstruck Baroness Mary Vetsera. The stage was set. The tragedy that would define Stephanie's life was about to begin, and she was the only person who had no idea it was coming. Rudolph's affair with Mary Vetsera was not a grand romance. Historians are clear on this. It was a brief, feverish, and morbid obsession. For Rudolph, he had finally found what he was looking for, not a partner in life, but a partner in death. Mary, in her youthful fanaticism, saw him as a tragic Byronic hero, and she truly believed that dying with him was the most romantic act imaginable. Their relationship, which lasted only a few weeks, was built almost entirely around this shared dark fantasy. While this grim pact was being formed in the shadows, what was Stephanie doing? She was living the hollow life of the crown princess. Her days were a monotonous, rigid schedule of official duties, of smiling at aristocrats who she knew gossiped about her, and of dedicating every spare moment to her only joy, her young daughter, Erzsi. She and Rudolph were completely estranged. They lived in separate wings of the Habsburg palace. They only spoke when court etiquette demanded it. She was aware he had mistresses. This was a painful public humiliation, but she likely had no idea about this specific 17-year-old girl. But in the last days of January 1889, this Cold War between them erupted into one final violent confrontation. This is a crucial, hidden part of the story, the moment that sealed everyone's fate. The incident began, as it so often did, with a public humiliation. At a formal dinner given by the German ambassador Rudolph, who was in a foul, agitated mood, openly and cruelly insulted Stephanie in front of the other guests. He made sarcastic, cutting remarks, undermining her and treating her with utter contempt. Stephanie, after nearly 8 years of this, had finally had enough. She was no longer the naive 17-year-old girl. She was a 24-year-old woman, a mother, who had endured the ultimate betrayal. She did not let it slide. Later that night in private, she confronted him. And this was not just about the dinner. Stephanie had learned of his ultimate final betrayal, one that went beyond infidelity, beyond even the disease he had given her. Rudolph, in his desperate, deluded state, had secretly written a letter to the Pope Leo XIII, asking for an annulment of his marriage to Stephanie. Let that sink in. This man had taken her innocence, destroyed her body, made her permanently sterile, and now he wanted to cast her aside as if she were the defective one. He wanted to declare their marriage null and void. For Stephanie, this was not just a personal insult, it was a direct threat to her child. If the marriage was annulled, what would that mean for the legitimacy of her beloved daughter, Erzsi? She confronted him, and sources from the time describe a furious, violent argument. It was not a quiet disagreement, it was a screaming match. She accused him of his treachery, and he, cornered and unstable, allegedly lashed out, screaming at her, perhaps even threatening her. The fight ended with Rudolf storming out, snarling that he was going to Mayerling to hunt. It was the last time she ever saw him. Their marriage didn't end with a sad, wistful goodbye. It ended with toxic, unrestrained hatred. Rudolf was now a runaway train. This fight with his wife on January 28th was only the first explosion. The next day, he had an even more fateful confrontation, this time with his father. Emperor Franz Joseph had been warned, possibly by the police who had been tipped off by Mizzi Casper or by his own spies, that Rudolf was entangled with the young Baroness Vetsera and that he was still spouting his dangerous, liberal political nonsense. The emperor summoned his son for a rare, private meeting. We will never know the exact words spoken, but the outcome was clear. It was a disaster. The emperor, a man of iron duty, ordered his son to end the affair with Mary at once. He ordered him to break off his friendships with liberal journalists, and he reportedly ended the meeting by screaming, "You are not fit to be my heir." For Rudolf, this was the end. His father, the one man he had fruitlessly tried to win approval from, had finally and completely rejected him. His wife hated him, his political dreams were dust, his health was shattered, and now the one dark escape he had planned with Mary was being forbidden. His mind, already ravaged by syphilis, morphine, and alcohol, finally snapped. The hunting trip to Mayerling was no longer just an escape, it was an execution. On that same day, January 29th, Rudolf drove out to the small remote hunting lodge at Mayerling, about 15 miles outside of Vienna. He had sent Mary Vetsera ahead in secret. She was snuck into the lodge and hidden in his rooms. His hunting guests, including his friend Count Hoyos, had no idea she was even there. They all had dinner together, and Rudolf, in a shocking display of compartmentalization, appeared agitated, but otherwise normal. While this was happening, Stéphanie was back in Vienna. She was probably relieved that Rudolf was gone, the terrible fight still ringing in her ears. She was completely unaware of the 17-year-old girl hidden at the lodge. She had no idea of the fight with the emperor. She was simply living her life, preparing for her normal duties, blissfully ignorant that her entire world was about to be annihilated. On the morning of January 30th, 1889, Rudolf's valet Loschek grew worried. The Crown Prince had ordered a 7:30 a.m. wake-up call, but he was not answering. Loschek knocked, then pounded on the locked door. Silence. Panicked, he got an axe and broke the door open. The sight that greeted him was the stuff of nightmares. The room was dark, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder. Baroness Vetsera was on the bed, cold and dead. She had been shot in the head. And Rudolf was sitting on the edge of the bed, slumped over a small table, a revolver on the floor beside him. He had shot himself in the temple. The news raced back to Vienna, but it did not race to Stéphanie. This is where the true systemic cruelty of the Habsburg court is laid bare. Rudolf's friend, Count Hoyos, raced his carriage back to the Hofburg Palace. Who did he go to first? Not Stéphanie. He went to the emperor's chief adjutant. They, in turn, went to the emperor. Franz Joseph was shattered. He knew his son was troubled, but this was unthinkable. His first immediate instinct was not grief. It was damage control. How would this look? They had to tell the empress. They sent a court official, Baron Nopcha, to Empress Sisi's apartments. Sisi, who was in the middle of her Greek lessons, was told her only son was dead. The shock was so great, she was said to have let out a single terrible cry. And Stéphanie, the wife, the crown princess, nobody told her. She was just down the hall in her own apartments, probably playing with her daughter Ersi, getting dressed for the day. She was left in the dark while the court machine frantically tried to decide on a story. Finally, Empress Sisi, in her own profound shock, realized the horrifying gap in protocol. "My God," she said, "we must tell her." But Sisi, the woman who had always despised Stephanie, couldn't bring herself to do it. At first she sent her lady-in-waiting, but then, in a rare, bizarre moment of duty, she changed her mind. She would do it herself. This is the scene. Imagine Stephanie being summoned urgently to her mother-in-law's apartments, a woman who never, ever summoned her for anything. She walks in, worried, and finds Sisi not as the beautiful, ethereal empress, but as a shattered woman pacing the room like a caged animal. According to Stephanie's own memoirs, she was still naive. She thought something had happened to the emperor. "What is it, Your Majesty?" Stephanie asked. Sisi stared at her, her voice dead. "Rudolph is dead." Stephanie froze. It didn't make sense. Dead? How? An accident? A hunting accident? And this is where Sisi delivered the second, more vicious blow, the first version of the court's cover-up. "No," Sisi said, her voice full of venom for the other woman. "He has poisoned himself, and he poisoned her." Stephanie was utterly bewildered. "Her? Her who?" "Baroness Vetsera," Sisi spat. "She was with him." In that one brutal exchange, Stephanie's world ended. She was forced to absorb every horrifying truth all at once. Her husband was dead, not from an accident, but because he had killed himself. He hadn't been alone. He was with his mistress. And in the most devastating realization of all, he had chosen to die with this 17-year-old girl, this stranger, linking himself to her for eternity, and deliberately not his wife. This was not just grief. It was the single greatest, most public humiliation a woman of her standing could possibly endure. It was a global announcement that she meant nothing, that his hatred for her was so profound he preferred to die with a teenager he barely knew than to live in the same world as his wife. And the cruelty was just beginning. The court machine, the one Stephanie was now outside of, went into hyperdrive. The story Sisi told her, poison, was a lie. They quickly realized a gunshot was harder to hide. The official story changed 3 times in 24 hours. At first, the court claimed it was a heart attack. When that story didn't hold, it was changed to a hunting accident. Finally, when the truth of the suicide became impossible to hide, the third and final version was released. Rudolph had committed suicide during a fit of madness. This was the most strategically crucial version, as declaring him mad allowed the staunchly Catholic Habsburgs to override the Church's law against burying a suicide on consecrated ground. Rudolph, the heir, was given a magnificent state funeral. He was buried in the imperial crypt in the Kaisergruft, with all the pomp and circumstance of a beloved prince. And what about the 17-year-old girl he murdered, Mary Vetsera? What the court did to her is perhaps the most ghoulish, telling hidden story of all. They couldn't let the public know she had been there. So, on a dark, rainy night, her uncles were summoned to Mayerling. They were forced to take her body, which was now in rigor mortis, dress it in her outdoor clothes, and prop it up in a carriage, sitting between them as if she were alive, just unwell. They drove this corpse, bobbing between them, through the dark, muddy woods to the nearby monastery at Heiligenkreuz. There, with no priest, no ceremony, and no family, she was hastily thrown into an unmarked grave in the corner of the cemetery, buried like an animal. This was the machine that Stephanie was now at the mercy of, a machine that would prop up a dead girl in a carriage to protect its image. And she, the living widow, the crown princess, was now the most inconvenient, most embarrassing person in the entire empire. She was a 24-year-old reminder of the entire sordid scandal. The machine had lost its use for her, and she was about to find out in the most brutal way possible what it does to the parts it no longer needs. For Stéphanie, the unthinkable had happened. Crown Prince Rudolf was dead, buried with all the honors of an empire. His 17-year-old mistress, Mary Vetsera, was dishonorably dumped in a secret grave. And Crown Princess Stéphanie was left standing alone in the ashes. She was 24 years old. In one brutal, bewildering 24-hour period, she had learned she was a widow, a victim of the most public humiliation imaginable, and a suspect in her own tragedy. The court, to protect its own image, had created its official story of Rudolf's fit of madness. But every story needs a villain. And since the dead prince had to be portrayed as a tragic, misunderstood victim, and the dead mistress was just a footnote, the court, the press, and the public all turned their eyes to the one person left standing, the living, breathing, inconvenient wife. This, my friends, is where Stéphanie's real tragedy begins. Mayerling wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of her 56-year-long ordeal. The first thing Stéphanie had to endure was the performance of grief. Imagine this. The entire empire was in mourning for a man you had come to despise. A man who had physically and emotionally destroyed you. A man whose final act was to publicly declare his preference for another woman in death. And you had to be the chief mourner. You had to walk at the front of the funeral procession, draped in the heaviest black crepe, your face hidden by a veil. You had to stand rigid in the freezing cold of the imperial crypt as his coffin was sealed. And all the while, you knew what everyone was whispering. The whispers were immediate, and they were venomous. She never loved him. She was too cold. She was the clumsy Belgian, the boor who couldn't keep her husband. She drove him to it. In the court's narrative, Rudolf wasn't a philandering, abusive, addicted man who murdered a teenager and killed himself. He was a sensitive soul who was misunderstood. And who the court needed to know misunderstood him the most? His wife. This narrative was not an accident. It was a calculated campaign, and it was led by the last person Stéphanie ever expected to find solace in, but the one whose cruelty would now define her life, her mother-in-law, the Empress Sisi. Sisi's grief was as theatrical, narcissistic, and all-consuming as her life had been. Having been almost entirely absent for Rudolf's life, she now became the high priestess of his death. She cloaked herself in permanent, dramatic black, which she would wear for the rest of her life. She spoke of her martyred son, her poor, poor boy. And in this new cult of grief, Sisi needed a heretic to blame. And she found one in Stéphanie. Sisi, who had always looked down on Stéphanie as a clumsy camel, now unleashed her full, icy contempt. She saw Stéphanie not as a fellow victim, not as a 24-year-old widow, but as the cause of the tragedy. In Sisi's twisted logic, it was Stéphanie's conventional nature, her lack of poetic spirit, her coldness, that had driven Rudolf to unhappiness, to despair, and ultimately to marry Vetsera. The anecdotes from the court at this time are chilling. Sisi would sweep past Stéphanie in the halls of the Habsburg as if she were invisible. She openly told other members of the court Rudolf's end began the day he married her. She referred to Stéphanie as a moral automaton, a plague, an evil spirit. Imagine the psychological torture. The mother of the man who destroyed your life now publicly, relentlessly blames you for his death. And she is the empress. Her word is law. The entire aristocracy, eager to curry favor with the grieving Sisi, took their cue from her. Stéphanie was no longer just disliked. She was a pariah. She was the woman who had, in their eyes, murdered the future. She would enter a room, and conversations would stop. She would be met with cold stares and quickly turned backs. She was, in every social sense, excommunicated. But the cruelty from Sisi, while emotionally devastating, was nothing compared to the cold, bureaucratic cruelty of her father-in-law, Emperor Franz Joseph. Franz Joseph was not an emotional man. He was a man of systems, of duty, of pragmatism. And when he looked at Stéphanie, he didn't see a grieving daughter-in-law. He saw a failed component. Stéphanie's job description had been simple: to be a dutiful wife to the heir and to produce a male heir. In his eyes, she had failed at both. It did not matter that Rudolf was the philanderer. It did not matter that Rudolf was the one who gave her the disease that made her sterile. In the 19th century patriarchal world of the Habsburgs, she was the one who had failed to manage her husband and failed to secure the line of succession. And now she was useless, worse than useless. She was a 24-year-old living, breathing, walking, talking reminder of the single greatest scandal the empire had ever faced. So the emperor, in his cold, practical way, began to dismantle her life, piece by piece. First, her status evaporated. She was no longer the crown princess, the future empress. She was now the dowager crown princess. It was a title that in that court meant nothing. It meant you were a relic. Her official duties were stripped away. She was no longer asked to represent the emperor at state functions. She was no longer the first lady of the court in Sisi's absence. She was, quite simply, put on a shelf. Then came the financial squeeze. Her household, once the grand establishment of the heir, was drastically cut. Her staff was dismissed. Her allowance was reduced. She was moved out of the opulent crown prince's apartments in the Hofburg and relocated to a smaller, less important wing of the palace. It was a public, deliberate demotion. It was the court's way of saying, you are no longer important. She was, in effect, a prisoner. The rigid etiquette of the court, which she had always found suffocating, now became her jailer. As the dowager crown princess, she was not allowed to simply leave. She couldn't just pack her bags and go back to Belgium. She was required to remain in Vienna, to be part of the court that despised her, to live in the very palace where she had suffered her greatest traumas. She was a ghost haunting the hallways of her own failed life. And what about her own family? Surely her father, King Leopold II of Belgium, would rush to her side, defend his daughter, and bring her home. This is another hidden, heartbreaking part of her story. Leopold II was furious, but he wasn't furious for Stéphanie. He was furious at her. Remember, Leopold was a CEO. His daughter's marriage was the most important business deal of his life. It had secured his new money dynasty a link to the most ancient throne in Europe. And now, Rudolf was dead. The link was broken. The investment was worthless. He didn't see a daughter shattered by grief and humiliation. He saw a failed asset. He too blamed Stéphanie. Why hadn't she produced a son in time? Why hadn't she been a better wife? Kept Rudolf in line, prevented this disaster. He offered her no comfort, no escape. Her own father saw her as a failure. Just as her in-laws did, she was utterly, completely, terrifyingly alone. Despised by her mother-in-law, demoted by her father-in-law, abandoned by her own father, and gossiped about by the entire continent. She was 24 years old, and her life was, for all intents and purposes, over. She had only one thing left in the world, one light, one reason to get out of bed in that cold, hostile palace. Her daughter, Erzi, Archduchess Elizabeth Marie, 5 years old, was the one pure good thing to come out of the marriage. Stéphanie adored her. She poured every drop of love, every bit of her shattered identity into her child. Erzi was her anchor, her purpose, and the emperor knew it. This, my friends, is the final, most unforgivable act of cruelty. This is the controversy and historical argument that shows the true nature of the Habsburg machine. Emperor Franz Joseph, the man of duty, decided that Stephanie, the daughter of a failed family, the widow of a madman, a woman now publicly blamed for the entire scandal, was an unfit mother to raise a Habsburg archduchess. He was the emperor. His word was law. He effectively, though not officially in a court, took custody of his own granddaughter. He declared that he would personally oversee Erzie's upbringing. He appointed her tutors. He dictated her schedule. He controlled her education. Stephanie's access to her own child was now severely restricted. She, the child's mother, had to make appointments to see her own daughter. Every visit was chaperoned. Every moment was monitored. She was forbidden from being a mother and was forced into the role of a visiting dignitary. This was the masterstroke of the court's cruelty. It wasn't just punishment, it was control. By holding Erzie hostage, the emperor ensured Stephanie's silence and compliance. What could she do? If she spoke out, if she fought back, if she tried to flee, he would cut off access to her daughter completely. So she stayed. She stayed in that palace, a 24-year-old ghost, enduring the daily snubs from Sisi, the cold indifference of the emperor, and the whispers of the court. She wore her black mourning, a prisoner in a gilded cage, forced to make appointments to see the only person on earth she loved. This was her life. The public humiliation was complete. The personal loss was absolute. She had lost her husband, her status, her reputation, and now her child. The machine had won. Stephanie had been erased. The question was, for how long can a human being endure being a ghost before they either fade away completely or learn to fight back? And for 11 years, that was Stephanie's life. 11 long, excruciating years. From the age of 24 to 35, she was the ghost of the Hofburg Palace. She was a state prisoner, bound by the invisible chains of court etiquette and her desperate love for her daughter. She endured the daily, silent humiliation. She watched her beloved Erzie grow up, watched the court and the emperor himself systematically poison her daughter's mind against her. Erzie was raised to be a true Habsburg, and she was taught implicitly and explicitly that her mother, the clumsy Belgian, was an outsider, a failure, the woman responsible for the great tragic myth of her martyred father, Rudolf. Can you imagine the pain? To have your only child look at you with the same cold, critical eyes as the court that despises you? Stephanie's life was a non-life. She was an empty vessel, a black-clad reminder of a scandal everyone else had turned into a romantic legend. She was expected to simply fade away, to grow old and gray and silent in her little wing of the palace, a forgotten relic. But Stephanie was not her mother-in-law, Sisi. She was not a creature of air and fantasy who could float away from her problems. And she was not her husband, Rudolf, who sought escape in death. She was the daughter of Leopold II. And while she lacked her father's monstrous cruelty, she had inherited his iron-willed pragmatism and a deep-buried instinct for survival. She was not going to fade away. She was going to fight back. Her rebellion didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, quiet awakening. After the initial shock and the suffocating grief, she began to do something the court had never allowed her to do. She began to live for herself. She was forbidden from leaving Vienna, yes, but she began to travel. At first, it was for health reasons, the only excuse a royal woman could use. She went to spas, to the south of France, to the Mediterranean, and with every trip, she spent a little more time away from the toxic air of the Hofburg. She was breathing. She was meeting people. She was remembering who she was, not as the Dowager Crown Princess, but as Stéphanie. The court watched this with disapproval. They called her frivolous. They whispered that her mourning wasn't sincere. She was supposed to be a tragic, perpetual widow, locked in the palace. Instead, she was living. And then in the late 1890s, more than a decade after Mayerling, she did the one thing that was completely, utterly unforgivable. She fell in love. His name was Count Elemer Lonier, and he was everything Rudolf had not been. He wasn't a prince. He was a Hungarian nobleman, a diplomat, but of a much lower rank. He wasn't a tortured, self-destructive genius. He was a kind, stable, intelligent, and gentle man. He was not a boy. He was a mature man who saw Stéphanie not as a political asset or a clumsy camel, but as a woman who had endured unimaginable suffering. He didn't want her title. He wanted her. Their relationship was a quiet, profound act of defiance. For Stéphanie, this was not the star-struck infatuation she'd had for Rudolf. This was a conscious, adult choice. This was a choice for kindness, a choice for stability, a choice for happiness. She knew with absolute certainty what this choice would cost her, and she decided to make it anyway. In 1899, she went to her father-in-law, Emperor Franz Joseph, the man who held her daughter's future in his hands, and she formally asked for his permission to renounce her titles and marry Count Lonier. This request was not a plea, it was a bomb. The emperor was apoplectic. This wasn't just a private matter, it was a scandal. The widow of the martyred Crown Prince Rudolf, his son, was proposing to throw away her imperial title, to marry some minor Hungarian count. It was an insult to Rudolf's memory. It was an insult to the dynasty. It was a public declaration that the glorious life of a Habsburg archduchess was, in fact, a prison she was desperate to escape. He forbade it. Absolutely not. He threatened her. He reminded her of her duty. He reminded her of her daughter. And here, in this hidden story, we see the final brutal break between Stéphanie and her own father, King Leopold II. Stéphanie, desperate, wrote to her father in Belgium, begging for his support, for his blessing. Leopold II's response was swift and merciless. He saw this marriage as the final idiotic failure of his daughter. It was an embarrassment. He not only refused to support her, he disowned her. He wrote her a letter of such venomous cruelty, disinheriting her and effectively casting her out of the Belgian royal family, that it shattered their relationship forever. She was now 35 years old. Her father had disowned her. Her father-in-law had forbidden her. The entire court was united against her. She had a simple, agonizing choice. Remain the Dowager Crown Princess, a wealthy, miserable, and respected ghost with limited, painful access to your daughter. Or throw it all away, your title, your income, your royal status, and your daughter, for a chance at personal happiness. What would you choose? Stéphanie made her choice. On March 22, 1900, at a quiet ceremony at the Miramar Castle near Trieste, 36-year-old Stéphanie of Belgium married 37-year-old Count Elemer Lonier. The retaliation from the Habsburg court was instantaneous and total. Emperor Franz Joseph was true to his word. He issued an imperial decree. Stéphanie was stripped of her title as crown princess. She lost her rank, her privileges, and her imperial income. She was no longer a Habsburg. She was no longer Her Imperial and Royal Highness. She was simply Countess Lonier. And then, the final, most devastating blow. The one she knew was coming, but which still tore her apart. The emperor declared that, by this unsuitable marriage, Stéphanie had forfeited her last remaining right as a mother. She was now legally forbidden from having any contact with her daughter Ersi. It was over. The 16-year-old Ersi, who had already been raised to resent her mother, was now told that her mother had abandoned her for a man. The break was complete, legal, and final. Stéphanie had paid the highest possible price for her freedom. She had traded her daughter for her husband. So, was it worth it? The life of Countess Launier was a world away from the Hofburg. She and Elemer settled in Hungary at his estate Orosvar. The guns of the empire were no longer pointed at her. The whispers stopped. The crushing weight of etiquette vanished. And for the first time in her adult life, Stéphanie was happy. Their marriage, by all accounts, was one of mutual respect, deep devotion, and quiet companionship. Elemer was her protector, her partner, and her greatest defender. He was her solace for the traumas she had endured. They traveled, they gardened, they read. They lived a life of quiet, aristocratic comfort, far from the spotlight that had almost destroyed her. She had survived. She had escaped the cage, but the ghosts of the past never fully disappear. In 1914, World War I erupted, sparked by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the man who had become the new heir after Rudolf's death. The war would destroy the very world that had defined her. Stéphanie and Elemer, caught in Hungary, turned their estate into a hospital. The former crown princess, who had once been groomed for nothing but state balls, now spent her days as a nurse, tending to the horrific wounds of soldiers from the empire that had disowned her. And in 1918, the war ended, and with it, the 1,000-year-old Habsburg dynasty. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed. Emperor Franz Joseph was dead. Sisi was dead. The entire world that had imprisoned her, the entire machine that had tried to crush her, was gone. Stéphanie, the clumsy Belgian, the failed asset, the useless widow, had outlived it all. Her old life was now just a memory, a history book, and she decided it was time to write her own history book. In 1935, now 71 years old, she published her memoirs, Ich sollte Kaiserin werden. I was to be empress. This book was her final act of defiance. It was her side of the story, and it was scathing. She held nothing back. She described the trauma of her wedding night. She described the coldness of the Hofburg, the suffocating etiquette, the political games. She exposed the cult of Sisi, painting her not as a tragic romantic, but as a cold, cruel, and selfish woman who had treated her with utter contempt. She detailed Rudolf's spiral, his moods, his cruelty, and her disgust at the moral and physical ruin he had brought upon her. The book was a sensation. It was a global bestseller, but it was also a scandal. The remaining Habsburgs, now living in exile, were furious. They denounced her as a bitter, lying woman, desecrating the sainted memories of Sisi and the martyred Rudolf. And what of her daughter? Erci, now a grown woman, a socialist known as the Red Archduchess, was so enraged by the book's portrayal of her father that she sued her own mother. The final tragic irony is that the lawsuit failed, but the relationship, already broken, was now shattered beyond any possibility of repair. They would never speak again. Stéphanie had told her truth, but it cost her the very last lingering thread of connection to her child. She lived on through yet another world war. She and her husband, Elemer, now in their 80s, were forced to flee their beloved estate as the Soviet Red Army advanced in 1945. They found refuge in a monastery, Pannonhalma Archabbey, in Hungary. And there, on August 23, 1945, in a small, quiet room in an ancient abbey, Stéphanie died. She was 81 years old. She had survived the death of her brother, the suicide of her husband, the collapse of an empire, and 2 world wars. Her devoted husband, Elemer, who had been her rock for 45 years, died just 9 months later. Rudolph's life ended at Mayerling. His tragic myth was just being born. Sisi's death turned her into a timeless romantic icon. But what about Stéphanie? History remembers her as the footnote, the clumsy, boring wife who was the collateral damage of a great tragic love story. But what if she wasn't the footnote? What if the woman who was blamed, discarded, and erased was the only one who truly survived? She is not a romantic hero like Sisi. She is not a tragic revolutionary like Rudolph. Her story is quieter, more complex, and I think far more human. She is a story of survival. She represents the millions of women, not just in royal courts, but throughout history, who were trapped by circumstance, blamed for the failures of men, and forced to pay an impossible price for their own happiness. She was a pawn in a game she never asked to play. She was groomed for a single purpose, to be an empress. And when that purpose was violently taken from her, she was discarded. But she refused to be discarded. Her life is a testament to the profound, quiet resilience of the human spirit. She endured humiliation, ostracism, and the loss of her child. She was erased, and yet she found a way to rewrite her own story. She found love again. She found peace. And in the end, she found her own voice and told her truth to the world. Consequences be damned. Mayerling is famous for the 2 people who died there, but perhaps the real story, the one with the most powerful lesson, belongs to the woman who survived it. The woman who lost her name, her status, and her child, but who, against all odds, managed to find and reclaim her life.